Hello, I'm Jamelle Wells, the ABC's court reporter. It's almost 20 years since Australian Story first spoke to the family of former nurse and childcare worker Lynn Dawson. The much-loved mother of two was living on Sydney's northern beaches when she vanished in suspicious circumstances 4 decades ago. In May this year, her then-husband, Chris Dawson, stood trial for his wife's murder. And last week, amidst a frenzy of media and public interest, Justice Ian Harrison handed down his decision. Tonight, we go behind the scenes with Lynn's family and friends as they wait for a verdict that gripped the nation.
The day after the verdict, we've come down here to Clovelly to put these flowers on the memorial seat to Mum and Dad and Lynn, just in recognition of their lives.
We did it, Lynn.
Yep. We did it.
We never gave up. When we went to buy the flowers this morning, the florist was in tears. And she was telling us about her network of friends who followed this story all these years, and it's just huge.
When this is all over, we'll always remember Lynn as the beautiful person she was. Gentle and caring, calm, funny. The first one to ring for birthdays. If she could give one gift, she'd give 3 gifts. She's just so generous.
Mrs. Wright came, John. We thought you'd like to really cool.
She was like the centre of things happening in the family.
Margaret suggested we go out to dinner.
We've always, over 40 years, remembered Lynn with such love.
But there was one time that I still get into trouble about from Chris. I was coming off duty nursing.
Everyone has a theory about what happened to Lynette Dawson. She was a nurse, a loving mother and a loving family person.
I thought probably the others was going to propose a toast.
Oh, let.
People are connected to it because they were just such a normal suburban family, and then suddenly it all went wrong.
An older man, a very attractive man, a young schoolgirl, an infatuation, a wife, and the possibility that she was murdered to make way for that relationship to flourish. I think that's what I would call the eternal triangle, and that's why it captured the public imagination.
One of the country's most high-profile trials is underway.
It was one of the most anticipated murder trials in recent years. The Teacher's Pet podcast really catapulted it into the public consciousness.
Are you happy that finally it's underway now?
Yes.
Yep.
Very happy.
I was very nervous, of course, but at last we were there. The decision of the judge is the finish for us. There's nothing else we can do. The most important thing to us is to find her where she is, to lay her to rest.
If you have someone missing, of course it's always there. It's just like walking down the street and seeing the back of a person and you're thinking, that's Lynn. And you walk up to the person and it might look like her from the back, but it's not her at the front.
I can remember after a year had passed, I decided I couldn't dwell on it all the time because it wasn't fair on my children. My daughter once said to me, "Mum, why can't we be like a normal family?" Our whole family has lived with this trauma for 40 years. It's very difficult to put into words the depth of grief you feel when a loved member of the family just drops out of your life. Mum didn't drive, so she'd take the train up to the Central Coast because that's where Chris had said that Lynn had run from.
6 stop per hour.
My mother never stopped searching for Lynn. We all were searching for Lynn.
She's never gone overseas. She's never applied for a passport. She's never applied for a Medicare card, a credit card. She doesn't bank with anybody. She's a registered nurse. She's not registered in any state or territory in Australia. And she's just basically been taken off the planet, never to be seen again.
Lynn and Chris both went to Sydney Girls and Sydney Boys High, and that's where they met. They were both prefects in their final year. They were a good-looking couple. They used to dress beautifully. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke. He was very physically fit, and he always looked good.
Pringle playing it. Dawson.
Chris Dawson and his twin brother Paul both played for the Newtown Jets from Rugby League and later both played in rugby union. Both good-looking men, both modelled on occasions.
Playing it to Dawson. He's going straight down the middle.
Do you ever resent that very close relationship between them? No, never could. The first question that people ask them is, oh, you must have a lot of fun swapping and changing around, and they've never done it. I think they've been accused of doing it on the football field.
When are you going to get the landscaping started?
Somebody a couple of years ago said, what is it like sharing a husband? And to me, it just seemed so silly because I hadn't put any thought of it, and you just join in. Happy birthday, boys. May you have many happy birthdays.
We were aware during the year 1981 that things didn't seem to be quite right.
Happy birthday.
The third time today.
Who's everybody?
I just thought, oh, it was a bit of a rough patch and things would sort themselves out. None of us knew how bad things were. I think Lynn covered up many of the problems. I think she had this image that wonderful children, a happy family, and I just think that she just couldn't face the fact that perhaps this image wasn't the real thing.
Yeah, he's doing something. Julie's still at the Central Coast. How is she going?
Lynn Dawson and I worked together at Warrable Children's Centre in the occasional care.
Because she lives not very far from you, isn't she?
She was the nurse and I was her childcare worker.
Yeah. She's a lovely girl. Yeah, she was a lovely girl.
Her workmates were her main friends and the people she spoke to, so we were very close to her.
Well, they were having marriage difficulties. I mean, she used to talk to me about it because my office was the staff room, as you girls know.
Lynn kept her marriage problems close to her chest, I suppose. She didn't give specifics.
Lynn did tell me that Chris was looking after one of his students. She had home problems and that Chris wanted to move her in to their place because she had nowhere else to go. I remember saying to Lynn, if you're having marriage difficulties, I don't think it's a good idea to bring a young student into your home.
Try to keep your legs straight.
She was a student at Chris Dawson's high school.
I think all the muscles I'm going to build for you for summer. And the girls chasing you along the beach.
Through that, they formed a relationship. She babysat for the Dawson family.
We all knew that Chris was having an affair and she just said nothing. You know, Chris, my Chris, always my Chris. My Chris, I trust my Chris all the time.
Before Christmas Day, Lynn had gone home and found the note on the bed. And he said, don't paint too dark a picture of me to the girls. Chris left to go to Queensland unexpectedly. I knew he'd left, but I didn't know he'd left with the babysitter.
Chris moved back to the family home and then, with Lynn, decided to seek counselling, which they went to on Friday the 8th of January 1982.
They came in the afternoon into the centre and I think it was Annette and Anna, two of the girls in the occasional care room, had seen them and Lynn was very positive. She was smiling. They did come down hand in hand down the alleyway And the girls felt very positive about it. They were pleased for Lynn. They thought, wow, you know, maybe this might help them and they can resolve their problems.
Yeah, no, we had a good day today.
That evening, Mum rang Lynn about 8:30.
No, good day. Yeah, she's fine.
We got Chris on the phone and she had a talk with him, and he said to Mum that everything was fine. They'd been to a marriage counsellor and everything was going to work out. And Mum said, "Can I speak to Lynn?"
The first thing Mum said is, "You sound a bit sozzled."
She said to Mum, "My husband's poured me a lovely drink and everything is just going to be fine." And she said it with a slurred voice.
Mrs. Sims thought that unusual because Lynn and Chris weren't drinkers. Lynn had organised to meet her mother the following day at the Northbridge bars at Northbridge.
Chris was working as a holiday job as a lifesaver, and Mum was going to meet Lynn and the children, and they were going to have a picnic there.
Shortly after Mrs. Sims arrived at the pool, Chris receives a phone call and comes back a short time later and tells Mrs. Sims that it was Lynn on the telephone saying that she needed some time away to sort things out.
Well, Mum was absolutely devastated and shocked. I mean, she'd spoken to Lynn just the evening before. I think the shock was that Lynn had left it all because it was just so unexpected, so out of character. Lynn, who just loved her children, loved her whole family.
Just the day before, I had seen her walking hand in hand with him, and she was looking forward to a positive outcome from seeing the marriage guidance counsellor. And then the next day she went missing.
Yeah, I can't remember her name. What's this one's name?
And I remember thinking, no way. There's no way she would ever have left her daughters. She just loved them dearly.
I think she might want to go to school today.
She was looking forward to seeing her daughter start school. It was a big event in her life.
Black shoes? Yeah?
And what mother would ever leave their daughter on the first day of school? You would never, ever do that.
Looking back at the time of Lynn's disappearance, we just couldn't understand. We were absolutely dumbfounded that she would leave.
All the information that we did receive in Lynn's disappearance was coming through Chris. He would bring up Mum and say, "Oh, Lynn's rung me, she needs more time to think." Or he'd ring up and talk to Mum and say, "Oh, she's been seen at Gosford." We had no reason whatsoever to doubt him because he was a part of the family.
Never seen her anywhere.
Some weeks after Lynn disappeared, we became aware that the student was now living in the home with Chris and the girls, obviously in a relationship.
2 years after Lynn's disappearance, Chris Dawson divorced Lynn in her absence and he married the babysitter. Then they subsequently went to Queensland. Lynn's disappearance was always treated as a missing person, and whenever inquiries were made, the family was always told she's an adult, she can leave whenever she likes, she can walk away from the family home.
I think a lot of that was because Chris Dawson was a celebrity at the time. He was a first-grade footballer, had been a first-grade footballer. He was on television ads. He was a teacher in the local community. I feel that they believed him. We expected police officers to turn up to investigate or to ask us some questions about when was the last time we saw Lynn, but that never happened.
And I said to Barbara, I'm writing a letter. When I first wrote my first letter to the Ombudsman, it was 3 years after she went missing. The detective came out and interviewed me then. That was the police, but all they said was, well, have you got any new evidence? And I thought, well, I'm not the police.
Chris Dawson and the babysitter, they had a daughter, and in 1990 the marriage had fallen apart, and his wife, his second wife, came back to Sydney, and reported to police her suspicions that Chris had been involved with Lynn's disappearance. I believe the police took Lynn's disappearance more seriously after that.
This is a record of interview between Detective Sergeant Paul Mager and Christopher Michael Dawson.
In 1991, police interviewed Chris Dawson about the disappearance of Lynette on the back of an interview with his second wife, JC. He denied having anything to do with his wife's disappearance.
The whole purpose of making allegations is to slur my character with an upcoming custody battle, which is an extremely nasty bitter. He also doesn't know it's not that I know avoid crying my heart out before there's no contact with him.
There were two inquests into Lynette Dawson's disappearance, one in 2001 and one in 2003. Both coroners referred the matter to the DPP, saying that charges should be considered for her murder. The DPP on both occasions declined to lay charges, saying that there was not enough evidence.
It was like, how much more do we have to, how much more evidence do we have to, and do we have to go through? How much more pain do we have to go through?
We're at a pool area of these premises where we intend this morning to dig with the possibility of a body being buried in this area.
The Dawson case was characterised by lots of stops and starts and kind of bursts in activity and investigation. And for a long time, Detective Damien Loon took carriage of the case and was investigating it. In 2015, he handed that over to Detective Daniel Poole.
They went through everything, you know, sort of like passport not being used, bank accounts not being used, Lynn's glasses. You know, she never went back to get her contact lenses.
We were on the verge of just saying, look, we've been looking for answers for Lynn for so many years. Maybe we should just let it lie now. And Headley came forward and saw my sister Pat, and he convinced us to, he wanted to do a podcast, and I actually said to my daughter, what's a podcast?
I was riveted by Lynn Dawson's story in 2001. The story was stunningly sad. It was tragic. I think you have to get a bit obsessed with the story as a journalist to really do it justice. And I really hoped that the DPP would reconsider its earlier decision to not prosecute. I decided that it might be possible to find evidence, information, witnesses who hadn't talked before.
Few people know more about the case than journalist Headley Thomas of the Australian newspaper. He's documented nearly a year of exhaustive investigation in his hit podcast, The Teacher's Pet.
The reason why she left him.
Headley having the podcast was massive for us because it opened up a whole avenue of people who came forward as witnesses.
She contacted police for the first time within several years of Lynn going missing.
The podcast gave us all hope, and it really pushed the whole story out there, and everyone was talking about it, and people were finally taking notice of her story.
We're very grateful for the work the police had done, and we're very grateful for Headley and the podcast. That was very powerful. And after that, we felt as if something might happen.
The former husband of missing Sydney woman Lynn Dawson was today arrested at his Gold Coast home.
I know I jumped in the air when I heard that he'd been arrested because this is what we'd aimed for, you know, all those years.
By Christmas 2018, Chris Dawson had been charged with murder. And he's always maintained his innocence.
But the journey for all of us from the arrest through to the trial was really long and arduous because the defence
did everything they could to appeal against going to court.
His legal team swung into action trying to have the case stayed. They argued that there was no way he could get a fair trial. They said witnesses would have listened to the Teacher's Pet podcast.
What he's done, in my understanding, has been to impact upon the reliability of witnesses.
They started out with the Supreme Court. They took it up to higher courts. It ended up in the High Court. In the end, it did get to trial.
But in her judgment, Justice Fullerton spoke about the potential for podcasts about true crime like this to undermine legal processes.
The trial was delayed, and in the end, Chris Dawson faced a judge-alone trial because it would be very hard to find a jury that would not have heard of this podcast or the media storm surrounding this particular case.
I'm looking forward to justice being served and the truth coming out in the next few weeks. So I just want the truth to come out.
Tonight, on trial for murder, a court hears that former teacher Chris Dawson wanted his wife dead so he could have a relationship with a schoolgirl.
By the time the trial did go ahead in 2022, there was a huge amount of interest in it. The courtroom itself was at capacity.
I'd seen him on TV a few times, but it was sort of strange sitting in court and looking straight across at him. Yeah, so I tried to actually move my gaze a little bit.
Chris Dawson's case was quite a difficult one. There wasn't any direct evidence of murder, no body, circumstantial case. A case of this kind, I think, is relatively rare, but they do go to trial.
The Crown case, in a nutshell, was that Chris Dawson, on or around the 9th of January in 1982, murdered Lynette Dawson in order to pursue a relationship with the family babysitter known as JC.
He was infatuated with her, the prosecutor said. He repeatedly asked her to marry him.
The defence case was that he had no motive to kill his wife. Although he cheated on her and took up with a new girlfriend, that didn't make him a murderer. And there was no actual proof that she had been even murdered, that she was dead. At the start of the trial, Lynn Dawson's family and friends painted a picture of a marriage that might be going wrong, that it was teetering, that the couple were arguing. The Crown suggested that Chris Dawson could be physically violent.
At the time of the alleged murder, Julie Andrew lived next to the Dawsons in Bayview on Sydney's northern beaches.
Julie Andrew spoke about one incident late in 1981. She could see into the Dawsons' yard. Chris Dawson had backed Lynette up against a trampoline and was towering over her and holding her by the shoulders and bellowing at her, and that Lynette was crying. Defence barrister Pauline David suggested that she had exaggerated the story that she told the court. They tied that to Julie Andrews' involvement in the Teacher's Pet podcast.
Make way.
But she really stuck to her story.
I was badly affected by the trial, especially the way the questions were asked by the defence barrister. People would be accused of lying.
Annette Leary's evidence in the trial was really distressing. The day before Lynn disappeared, she came back from marriage counselling and apparently she had marks around her throat. And when Annette questioned her what it was, she explains that in the lift going up to counselling, that Chris had put his hands around her neck.
It was brutal in respect of all this information coming out and trying to take it all in. It was quite emotional.
In their cross-examination of Annette Leary, the defence really went hard, and they also intimated that her memories were coloured by those of others involved in the Teacher's Pet podcast. This idea of the podcast being really problematic for the recollections of witnesses was a strong thread through the trial.
It's been a day of explosive testimony at the Chris Dawson murder trial as the babysitter who became his new wife took the stand.
The Dawsons' former babysitter, JC, wasn't in the podcast and had never really spoken publicly about their relationship. JC characterises her relationship with Chris Dawson as one that was essentially subject to a huge power imbalance. She said that often after biology, she would come back to her bag to find a note from him. He was her date to the high school prom.
JC painted a picture of a teacher who was obsessed with her, infatuated with her, and she didn't know what to do. After she finished Year 12 in the new year of 1982, she went up the coast with friends and she wanted to end the relationship with Chris Dawson. But his response was to drive up the coast and collect her and move her into the family home. And this was just a couple of days after Lynn had disappeared. JC gave evidence that he was controlling, that he told her what to wear, what to do.
Were you trying to destroy Chris Dawson?
The defence case was that she made up a lot of that evidence because when her marriage with Chris Dawson broke up, there was a bitter custody dispute.
But JC was a really compelling witness who spoke with a lot of conviction, and she didn't make things easy for the defence.
Chris Dawson's murder trial has heard claims his wife Lynette was alive and well 2 years after she was reported missing.
A big part of the defence case rested on alleged sightings.
This included things like neighbours seeing Lynette standing at a bus stop or working in a hospital or standing at a fruit market. For the defence, it was very important that these proof of life sightings were established because throughout the trial, the court heard that the only person who ever claimed to have heard from Lynette since she disappeared in 1982 was her husband. That fact hung over the trial because you would imagine if she'd contacted Chris Dawson, she would have contacted someone else in her family, and the Crown pointed that out often.
The marathon murder trial for former Sydney teacher Chris Dawson has finally come to an end. The judge will now consider his verdict.
So 20 years ago since we sat here and spoke about it.
Oh, my God, where has it gone?
I have to be honest, I didn't actually ever think it would get to this point.
Nor did I.
Judgment Day tomorrow, and I'm very excited about going. This is the finale. This will be the end of a long, long road.
So are you going?
I'm going. And my families, my children who have been listening to me rave on about this for years.
The whole of their lives.
Yes.
I am going. I'm going to be there.
I know, but it's
what.
going to be
Yes.
very crowded, so I don't know how we're all going to fit in.
Did you ever imagine you'd be in this position today, Mr. Dawson?
Accused killer Chris Dawson will finally learn his fate today.
Chris, are you feeling nervous this morning? He arrived to a huge media scrum. He was flanked by his closest family and friends.
Do you think he'll walk out a free man today?
We knew there'd be a lot of press, but we certainly weren't prepared for the barrage trying to get into court there. That was just overwhelming.
Even though I've been retired for 10 years, I cannot help but listen in to or watch recordings of judgments in important cases, and this was an important case.
Silence, who's there? The Queen and Christopher Michael Dawson for judgment.
Because it was a judge-alone trial, it was necessary for the judge to go through virtually every witness.
I want now to deal with Mr. Dawson's telephone calls with Lynette Dawson.
He had to go through every proposition advanced, both by the Crown and the defence.
I'm unable to accept that the version of events at the Northbridge Baths suggesting Mr. Dawson received an STD call from Lynette Dawson on the afternoon of 9 January 1982 could reasonably be true.
It was a pretty damning start. The judge found that Chris Dawson had told lies about his wife contacting him after her disappearance. And then the next part.
I am reinforced in that conclusion as well by reason of other circumstantial evidence That leads me to conclude that Lynette Dawson did not leave her home voluntarily.
At that point of time, I think there wasn't much left of hope for the defendant. However, then people would have heard the judge say, but none of that means that Chris Dawson is guilty of murder. At that stage, they may have thought the judge was going in a different direction.
What I propose to do is to take half an hour for lunch.
I must say I was surprised that when lunchtime arrived, the judge announced that he was only halfway through his decision.
It has been an absolute marathon sitting day in court.
Who can describe it? Ups and downs from Judge Harrison with his summation.
1 minute you've got your hopes up and the next minute, no, it's not going to happen.
The first half, I thought, oh yeah, we're going really well. And then after the half an hour break, we went down again and I thought, oh no.
After the break, there were a lot of aspects of the evidence that the judge rejected. The arguments that Chris Dawson had engaged in physical violence against his wife was thrown out the window. A lot of the Crown propositions that were central to the motive argument were thrown out the window. The judge was really trying to hone the case down to its simplest basis. One, that Chris Dawson told lies after her disappearance, which in his mind were lies told from a consciousness of guilt. And secondly, he was possessively infatuated with the young girl.
I'm satisfied that the prospect that he would lose your so distressed, frustrated, and ultimately overwhelmed him that, tortured by her absence up north, Mr. Dawson resolved to kill his wife. Christopher Michael Dawson, on the charge that you did murder Lynette Dawson, I find you guilty. You may sit down.
We were just stunned. It just happened so quickly that the judge announced he was guilty.
Mr. Dawson, it will be necessary for you to be taken into custody.
The handcuffs going on, the judge saying, Mr. Dawson, you have to go now. Wow, yeah.
Breaking news now, and a judge has found a former teacher guilty of killing his wife in 1982.
Guys, if you want to just come down the steps, maybe.
Right at the end, after 5.5 hours, it was just amazing.
I think we're all in a bit of shock. It was really hard, right to the very end, to even know which way it was going to go.
I would think that the verdict did clearly bring comfort to the family, but it is a tragic situation, whether it be Lynn's family or whether it be Chris Dawson's family. It's a tragedy.
I thought, well, holy cow, he's had 40 years alive. He's been found guilty of murdering his sister. Why couldn't he just walk away? We'd still have a sister. Having a murder verdict brings a conclusion to one part of the story, but there's still another part of it is, where is she? Clovelly is part of the Sims family. This is all the kids brought up. So if we ever find Lynn, I believe that she deserves to have her ashes scattered off here at Clovelly with Mum and Dad.
We were sent a photograph from a nursing colleague at the Children's Hospital. She was very attached to a little girl who was sick. Maybe she'd come from the country and didn't have family there, but Lynn used to go down. She'd be there comforting her and visiting her when she was off duty. It's a very special photo for us because it just shows the sort of person she was.
Lynn was a loving, caring person, loved life, loved the children, and was just full of life, just full of life.